Hi everyone, I'm Matt, and welcome to QWHD Home Delivery.
Ding dong! Chocolate bone delivery coming my way!
No scruff. QWHD Home Delivery is bringing clear Bible teaching to you, not choc-coated bones.
Oh, rats.
And it's Easter time, and on Good Friday, the Friday of the Easter weekend, we remember that Jesus died on a cross.
What? That doesn't sound like a Good Friday. It sounds like Jesus lost.
It may sound like that, but today Anthony and Jordan are going to help us see that that is not the case.
Hi everyone, I'm Anthony. You know, right at the moment, the world looks like it's out of control. Some people are getting sick, some people are losing their jobs, and nearly all of us have to stay inside and can't go out and play with our friends. Everything looks a little bit out of control. But today, we're going to be reminded that even when things look out of control, that Jesus is still in control. Actually, I want your help with this talk as well. Whenever I say it may have looked like things were, I want everyone to start waving your arms around and say, out of control. And then I'm going to say, but Jesus was, and I want you to cross your arms and say in a big voice, in control. All right, let's practice that. It may have looked like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. Okay, let me tell you what happened. It was dark as Jesus led his disciples to a garden where olive trees grew. Suddenly, some torches could be seen. As the torches drew closer, some soldiers came into sight. These soldiers were carrying weapons to arrest Jesus. And leading the soldiers was a man named Judas. Judas was one of Jesus' own disciples, but he had turned against Jesus and was now betraying him. But even though it was dark, Jesus didn't run away. Instead, Jesus let himself be arrested. The only thing that Jesus said was, "Let my disciples go. Don't hurt them." And so Jesus' disciples, they all ran away unharmed, while Jesus was arrested alone. But John tells us that this happened to fulfill the words that Jesus had said. In John chapter 6, verse 39, Jesus said, "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Even as Jesus was arrested, it may have looked like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. Well, Jesus had been led away to the high priest's house, and following at a distance was Jesus' best friend, Peter. When Peter got to the courtyard of the high priest's house, a servant girl saw him and she asked, "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" Well, Peter got scared and he said, "No." As Peter stood near the fire to keep warm, another man looked at Peter and asked him the same question. "Aren't you one of Jesus' disciples?" Again, Peter got scared and he said, "No." And then another man said, "I saw you out in the olive garden. You are one of Jesus' disciples." And now Peter was really scared and he said, "No, I am not." And just then, a cock-a-doodle-doo broke across the night as a rooster crowed. And Peter broke down and cried. But John tells us that all this happened just as Jesus had said. Because in John chapter 13, verse 38, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times." Even as Jesus' best friend denied even knowing Jesus, it may have seemed like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. Now, Pilate was the Roman governor. That meant that he was the one in charge, and so he was sitting on the judge's chair. But as Jesus stood before Pilate, it was obvious that Jesus had done nothing wrong. And so Pilate wanted to let Jesus go. But the people had turned against Jesus. And as one big crowd, they yelled, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" When someone was crucified, it meant that their hands and their feet would be nailed to a cross, and they would be lifted up from the earth and killed. And well, even though Pilate knew that Jesus had done nothing wrong, he sentenced Jesus to be crucified. But John tells us that this all happened just as Jesus had said. In John chapter 12, verse 32 to 33, Jesus said, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. For Jesus to save people and to draw them to himself, he had to die. So even as Jesus was sentenced to death on a cross, it may have looked like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. Jesus was lifted up onto a cross, and there he stayed for hour upon hour. Slowly his life was fading away. He did not look powerful or in control at all. And yet, John chapter 19 verse 28 says, knowing that all was now completed, and so that the scripture would be fulfilled, Jesus said, I am thirsty. And when the people heard this, they dipped a sponge in some vinegar and they put it on a branch and they lifted it up to Jesus' lips. Usually, drinking this vinegar gave the person energy to live on a little bit longer. But as soon as Jesus had drunk it, he said, "It is finished." And then Jesus bowed his head and gave up his spirit. John tells us this was happening just as Jesus had said. In John chapter 10, verse 18, Jesus says, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own authority." Even as Jesus died on the cross, it may have looked like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. Well, boys and girls, our world does look like things are out of control, and that can seem scary. But today, as we remember that Jesus was killed on a cross, well, it may have seemed like things were out of control, but Jesus was in control. And that has not changed. Even when things may still look out of control, we can know that Jesus is still in control. And so we can and we must trust him.
Whoa! Jordan's a quick drawer.
Indeed he is. But isn't that great news? That even in the worst of situations, Jesus is still in control.
Yeah, but Matt, Jesus still died, so he can't be in control anymore.
Yeah, but Scruff, remember that Good Friday is not the end of the Easter weekend. On Sunday, we will see just how in control Jesus is.
If you say so.
I do say so. If you haven't already signed up for QWHD home delivery, then you can go to www.quizworks.com/home delivery. And you can get some activity sheets, some game ideas, and some discussion questions that you can do together as a family, as you keep thinking about just what it means that Jesus is in control.
Game ideas? Oh, did you hear that, Cedric? We can play some games.
See you soon.